So welcome to the eighth webinar, officially the eighth webinar installment of the Exchange Data Centers 101. We had originally planned just 6. Then we had our in-person panel and discussion, and now we are continuing with our 8th webinar. So today we will be tackling the topic of data centers and permitting. I am Dr. Natasha DeJarnett of the Christina Lee Brown Environment Institute at University of Louisville. I lead community engagement in the Institute, and I serve in the research teams of Greenheart Louisville and the Superfund Research Centers. And I am honored to acknowledge my colleagues in this process, Doctors Candy Walker and Joy Hart, who lead the Community Engagement Core at Greenheart Louisville, and Doctors Ted Smith and Lauren Heverly, who lead the Community Engagement Core of the Superfund Research Center here at University of Louisville. This center is hosted by the Christina Lee Brown Environment Institute, and it's for a program that's called The Exchange that brings together the community engagement initiatives of both Greenheart Louisville and the University of Louisville Superfund Research Center. We also want to thank Physicians for Social Responsibility for being a sponsor of this series. As we get started, I will note that the opinions expressed by the presenters are that of their own and do not necessarily represent the views of University of Louisville or the Christina Lee Brown Environment Institute, nor do the use of logos therein indicate endorsement. So by now, so many of you are veterans to this activity. We have a few goals of this series. Really, ultimately, we want to build shared knowledge between experts around the emerging topic of data centers, share resources, and understand multiple viewpoints, including the impacts to health, economics, environment, policy, and communities. And today, as we'll explore permitting and those relationships. So please continue to share your resources in the chat as you have been doing. Please continue to engage in dialogue in the chat. And if you can answer some of the questions in the chat, we welcome that as well. The chat is like the second most important part of this webinar series. So please continue to stay actively involved in the chat. You all have been super respectful this entire series, understanding that there are multiple viewpoints and viewpoints on top of viewpoints. And being respectful in your questions of our speakers and of each other, even in the chat. So please continue to do that. Keep the questions and the comments coming. And we're excited to once again learn more about you. So we're going to start with our usual Menti poll. We've added some new questions, and we've tried to get some questions that are more specific to permitting. We'll leave this here for a second. There are a couple ways that you can join. You are able to go to menti.com and type in 3963-0467. Again, that's 3963-0467, or you can scan the QR code that's on the screen. We are going to switch to our Menti presentation now, but you will still have this QR code on the screen as well as the access code when we switch. Okay, we've got our first question up now. Thank you so much, Eviana, for doing that. And our first question is, would you support or oppose a data center being built in your community? And we know that this answer is more complex than just support or oppose. So you have those two options, but you also have maybe if it's not too close to homes, and still deciding. We need more webinars, and we welcome any webinar suggestions you may have. So it looks like some of you have participated so far. Looks like some people are still logging in. Thus far, we are seeing 0 in the support category, a majority in the opposed category, and a couple people that say maybe and still deciding. All right, a couple people now still deciding, still more opposed, and we're seeing one support. We've got a diversity of opinions here. Glad that we included all of these types of answer options. I'm sure there are more answer options that could cover all the things that each of us are thinking as we consider this. Thank you, Joy, for dropping that Menti poll link in the chat. We'll go on to our next question. How knowledgeable are you about data centers and permitting? And you have a 5-point sliding scale. You could go from not knowledgeable at all to extremely knowledgeable. I think this will help our speaker for the day to understand who he's working with. So thank you for being honest in your responses. This is great. I'm grateful that so many joined this topic and are expressing that they're not knowledgeable at all. So you are in the right place at the right time to learn more about the aspects of data centers and permitting. Great. I see people are still logging on. Most that are on have already responded. Fantastic. We can move ahead to our next question. So what impact do you think permitting plays on data center development? Do you think it has a little bit of impact? A lot of impact. This is another sliding scale. You have a 5-point range of options here. So you all think it has a lot of impact. It's so interesting. I'm right there with you. It's something that a lot of us are not super knowledgeable of, but we acknowledge that it has a lot of impact on the development of data centers, or we believe it has a lot of impact on the development of data centers. Excellent, thank you. And all right, you once again have a few options to choose from. Select only 3. What factors do you think should influence permitting? And the options include health, proximity to communities, environment, utility infrastructure, community input, land use type, cumulative impacts. That means the added number of burdens in a certain area, and heat island effect. All right, answers are coming in all at once. And I'm looking to see kind of what the top 3 the group is considering. So far, that's environment, health, and community input. Oh, it's growing for health and community input. It's still environment, health and community input. Health is rising up to the level of environment, followed by community input. Great, thank you all for weighing in. Health and environment are still tied, followed by community input, and those are then followed by cumulative impacts and proximity to communities. Great, thank you all so much for participating. We'll go into our last question. Right, now this is one of those rankings where you rank these in the order that you personally see as most important for data center permitting. And these options include air pollution, noise pollution, proximity to neighboring communities, the size of the data center, the potential utility costs expected to customers, geopolitical positioning, and tax revenues. I got so excited to get to these ranking options. I don't think I actually read the question to you. So here's the question. Rank the factors that you see as most important for data center permitting. And then you have your choices here on the screen. Air pollution, noise pollution, proximity to neighboring communities, size of the data center, utility cost to customers, and geopolitical positioning. Right, we're getting some answers in. Give people a little bit more time to respond because you've got 7 options to choose from and to put them in a order that you deem most important, from most important to least important to you. Right, air pollution is holding pretty steady in the #1 spot. Proximity to the neighboring communities, followed by the utility cost to customers. These are rising as top concerns, then followed by noise pollution, size of the data center, geopolitical positioning, and tax revenues. Very interesting. Thank you all so much for participating. Let's see, I think there are a few people still answering. Okay, interesting. Air pollution is holding pretty steady there in the number one position. It looks like proximity to the neighboring communities is not too far behind, followed by the utility cost to customers, and then noise. All right, the proximity to neighboring communities is now the top ranked among this list of options, followed by air pollution and utility cost to customers. All right, thank you so much for participating. We can leave this poll active, but we'll exit this. We have a short video to share about a news story from Ohio on data centers and permitting. And so we'll share this briefly. It's a 3-minute video. And then after that, I'm really excited to introduce our special speaker today.
Major concerns tonight in Boomtown about what is in the water that's coming out of data centers. There's a proposed permit from the Ohio EPA that would allow data centers to get rid of wastewater into lakes and streams.
There are at least 120 data centers just in the Columbus area, shown on this map here behind us. 10 TV's Kevin Landers joins us live tonight near the Scioto River. Kevin, what are environmentalists telling you?
Well, environmental groups say they're very worried that if these permits get approved, the quality of water in Ohio will suffer.
On average, a single data center uses 500 million gallons of water a day for cooling, according to industry reports. Some of that wastewater could be discharged into Ohio's lakes and streams under a permitting process under review by the Ohio EPA. Environmental groups have concerns about the impact to water quality in rural communities.
It's like a small city, the discharge that will come out of these. And that will, if they don't have a sewage treatment plant, that will go into the streams or the river or another body of water.
Under the Ohio EPA's proposal, data centers that qualify for the water discharge would get a 5-year permit to release water used to cool down tech components. In a statement to 10 TV, the Ohio EPA said, quote, Ohio EPA does not allow discharges that harm aquatic life, recreation, or human health. Every permit includes strict limits and monitoring requirements to ensure water quality standards are met at the state and federal levels. Opponents worry about the chemicals inside the discharged water, like PFAS, also called forever chemicals.
Most of our rural treatment systems do not have the ability to filter this out. So if you're discharging water with those possible contaminants, it's definitely going to lower the water quality.
The EPA says data centers are not expected to be a source of PFAS and have not been identified by the U.S. EPA as potential dischargers. Under a draft permit, data centers couldn't discharge water that exhibits the reasonable potential to break Ohio's minimum water quality standards. Discharges can occur in a lake other than Lake Erie or into groundwater supplies, and discharged water that doesn't meet water supply standards could not be discharged within 500 yards upstream from a public water supply intake. While the state's water protection program, known as H2O Ohio, doesn't set rules for pollutant discharges, opponents question if the state can ensure the state's water system is protected if the discharge permits are approved.
I don't really think the EPA in Ohio is a good enough steward. I don't think there are enough people on staff to cover the amount of data centers and the volume that they're proposing right now.
Now, the public has until January 16th to file a comment with the Ohio EPA about these permits. We have information on how you can reply on our website at 10tv.com. Reporting live downtown, Kevin Landers, 10 TV News.
So as you can see from the video, that is a complex and interesting topic that we are delving in today around permitting. And that's just one maybe small aspect of permitting as it pertains to data centers. So here to lead this conversation today is Tony Arnold. Tony Arnold is the Boehl Chair in Property and Land Use at University of Louisville, where he teaches in the Brandeis School of Law and in Urban Planning and Sustainability, as well as the PhD programs of the Development of Urban and Public Affairs. He also directs the Interdisciplinary Resilience Justice Project. He received the Trustees Award and several other awards for his teaching and mentoring, and many national and international awards and honors for the impact of his research on knowledge as well as on public policy and law. Professor Arnold's research, teaching, and community service are at the intersections of resilience and adaptive capacities, resilience justice, environmental justice, planning, including adaptive planning, watersheds, green and blue infrastructure, land use, water, climate change, green gentrification, inclusive community engagement and empowerment law, and adaptive governance institutions. His books include Fair and Healthy Land Use, Environmental Justice and Planning from APA, and the forthcoming Racial Justice and American Land Use from Cambridge. His community engaged research has received funding from the US EPA, the USGS, the US Geological Service, National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, Housing and Urban Development, and several foundations. Professor Arnold has served on many government commissions and nonprofit boards, including the Louisville Climate Action Task Force. Professor Arnold, I am so excited to hand the baton off to you. We are in your hands. We look forward to what you'll share with us about data centers and permitting. Oh, Professor Arnold, you are muted.
Sorry, I was looking for my PowerPoint there. Okay, so um,
While he launches his PowerPoint, I'll just say this is a dream. We're here at the same institution and we haven't had a lot of opportunities to partner and collaborate. So we're super excited to get to feature his expertise today. All right, we see your slide. Everything is perfect. You have the floor.
Super, thanks. I appreciate that. So yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to be talking about data center permitting, and so I very much appreciate Natasha and Joy and the others inviting me to do this. It's such a joy to work with the Environment Institute and be a part of this. What I'm going to talk about today is just one slice of data center permitting, because if we talked about all of the different kinds of permits that data centers might be subject to, we would be here all day. There may be, depending on your jurisdiction, on the state and city you're in, there may be various environmental permits, air permits, and water permits, and other kinds of waste permits and so forth that might be required. And so we're not going to talk about those because those will vary a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. What we're really going to talk about is the siting of data centers and the growing tendency to use conditional use permitting at the local land use level to regulate both where data centers go, but also impose conditions on them and determine whether or not their impacts are, are being, are either too substantial to be approved, or whether they're being properly minimized or mitigated and that sort of thing. I'm also going to talk, I'm not going to talk a lot about variances. I'll touch on that just a bit. Variances are land use permits that allow a applicant, a landowner or user of land, to deviate from the strict requirements of the zoning code. And so the most common have to do with things like setback requirements, height requirements, parking requirements, other sorts of things really related to kind of the size and shape of the property or the size and shape of the structures. But they can involve things like environmental impacts. Say for example, a variance that would allow more discharge of water or more generation of pollution or that sort of thing. And so variances are also a possibility. But again, we could spend a lot of time talking about those. And so we're going to focus more on the siting kinds of issues and the upfront rules that are imposed. But I do want to call your attention to the idea that variances are allowed. One of the reasons we're not going to talk about variances is because in the majority of states, you cannot use a variance to allow a use that is otherwise prohibited by the zoning code. So that is a rule that says use variances are not allowed. And so in Kentucky, use variances are prohibited. You cannot use a variance as a way to allow a land use that's otherwise prohibited by the zoning code. But there are states where variances are allowed, and the rules under which they're allowed are are multiple, very complex, vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So again, that's something that we would have to spend quite some time delving into. Let me just mention a little bit about my background. As Dr. Desjardins mentioned, I teach in both the law school and the Department of Urban and Public Affairs, direct the Transdisciplinary Resilience Justice Project. And my background is that I lived in an environmental justice frontline community in California when I was a child. And that sparked my interest, which has become really a lifelong interest, a career-long interest in the relationship between land use and the environment. When I was in law practice, I served as a city attorney in Texas and represented a variety of governmental institutions as well as community groups and as well as industry. So a real range of clients. Then as I moved into academia, my first full-time teaching position was at the University of Puerto Rico. So I kind of saw that kind of experience. But I served as chairman of the Planning Commission for the city of Anaheim, which made not only planning and zoning decisions, but also decisions regarding conditional use permits, variances, subdivision maps, and the like. So I've been on the decision-making side of that. And then since I've been in Louisville for the past 21 years or so, I've been deeply involved in various community groups trying to address land use and environmental issues in the communities here in Louisville. I want to start by pointing out that when it comes to permitting, the starting point is what is the relevant zoning. So permitting of land uses is determined by the zoning code, by what is in the zoning code and how the property in question is zoned. So if a data center wants to pick a particular site, locate on a particular piece of property, the question is, how is that property zoned and what does the zoning require or allow? And so the options are that the data center might be permitted by right, or it might be prohibited altogether, or the third option is it might be conditionally allowed with a conditional use permit or a CUP. And kind of one of the things we need to start with is the idea that up until recently, most local zoning codes did not expressly address data centers. This is kind of a relatively new phenomenon. Data centers aren't entirely new, but sort of the growth and development of data centers is relatively recent. And of course, it's getting attention all over the country, witnessed by the fact that there are so many of you here in this session and really interested in these issues. And so local governments have had to scramble to catch up with the fact that they didn't have data centers as a designated land use or as a particular use listed in various zoning districts in their zoning code. Now, one might sort of assume, well, then if they're not listed, then they must be prohibited. Lots of zoning codes say, well, if a use is not expressly allowed or conditionally allowed, listed somewhere in the zoning code, then it's prohibited. And that's certainly defensible if a city takes that position, because many of them have that sort of catch-all language that says that the default is that it's prohibited. In reality, what happens is local governments try to find an analogous use designation in the zoning code, and sort of lump data centers into that until they can amend their zoning codes to include data centers as a use that's designated maybe by right in some districts, conditionally allowed in other districts, and prohibited altogether in the remaining districts. What this tells us is that before we ever even get to permitting, we have to really pay attention to what is the underlying zoning in our communities, and what does it allow or not. So well, basically, as long as I've been here in Louisville, I have been in conversations with the Louisville Metro Planning and Design Services about are very old, very antiquated and patchwork industrial zoning patterns in Louisville that place both manufacturing districts. We have multiple manufacturing zones, and then also what's called the easy zone or enterprise zone, which is also allows industrial uses. And those are placed near or even in amongst residential neighborhoods. Most of those neighborhoods are in West, Southwest, or South Louisville. There's a little cluster out in the far East End as well. In those neighborhoods, as you might imagine, are overwhelmingly African American or Latina, immigrant, or low income, that sort of thing. And so when we're talking about, is it appropriate to have data centers in an industrial zone, we have to ask, well, where is the industrial zoning? Have we updated the industrial zoning? Have we reformed the patterns of industrial zoning, or are we basically placing these centers in amongst residential areas? And by the way, that pattern is pretty much across the board. There is variation from city to city. Some cities are, don't have quite as much disparity in industrial zoning as others do. But that's basically the study I did in Fair and Healthy Land Use, Environmental Justice and Planning, the book you see there, book cover you see on the left, where I looked at, how we have higher rates of industrial zoning in low-income neighborhoods of color, and there have been subsequent publications by the American Planning Association with subsequent studies, particularly by Christine Quattro, who did a really very interesting analysis that shows these patterns. So that leads us to talking about then, if a data center is listed as conditionally allowed and therefore subject to a conditional use permit requirement, what are the regulatory standards for granting or denying the conditional use permit, or the CUP? And these are going to be the rules that apply to whether or not the data center is allowed and under what conditions. And this has become probably the most common approach for permitting of data centers in determining whether they can exist or not. As I said, in addition, there may be various environmental permits, air permits, water permits, waste permits, those sorts of things that govern how they operate, what they can do, and that sort of thing. But whether they exist or not, whether they're going to be in this site or not, that is primarily a decision made by the local government, and it has become increasingly common throughout the United States for that to be a decision about a CUP, or a conditional use permit. And so when the entity that is making that decision, it is often either a Board of Zoning Adjustment or a planning commission. Sometimes that terminology varies from locality to locality, but that's usually going to be the entity that's making the decision. Sometimes those decisions are appealable to the city council or whatever the name is of your local legislative body, your elected body, and sometimes they might, affirm what the commission or board did, or they might overturn it or make an alternative decision. But by and large, whoever's making the decision has to apply the regulatory standards for granting or denying a CUP. And there are sort of two clusters of standards that are going to appear in the zoning code. The first are the standards that apply to all CUP applications. And these are often relatively broad standards related to the impact of the proposed use, in this case, the data center, on public health, safety, and welfare, the traffic impacts, is the lot an appropriate size and shape for the proposed development, and those kinds of things. And these are kind of across the board. And when I say generic, I'm not meaning that they are meaningless. They actually can be used quite effectively to regulate and review the data center application. But they're standards
Je me
that are
sentais
going
pas mal. Oui, c'était un plaisir. Et il y avait encore une fois beaucoup
If
d'échanges. J'ai
everyone
entendu
could
beaucoup.
please mute. I think we've got it taken care of. Thank you, Tony.
Okay, super. Okay, thanks. So these are going to be standards that apply to, basically all CUP applications of any type of land use that's conditionally allowed. In addition, what's happening is local governments are adopting standards that are also specific to data centers. And they may vary by the size of the data center, and they're aimed at specific impacts, operating issues, design components, and land use issues regarding the data centers. And so that's going to vary from locality to locality. And one of the things I want to caution, especially for those folks who are here in Louisville, where the Louisville Metro government is currently considering an ordinance that would adopt conditional use permit regulatory standards that specifically apply to data centers, is to not get those proposed standards fixed in your mind, because they undergo lots of revisions before they're finally adopted. So it's it's what the standards that apply are the ones that are the ones that are finally officially adopted. When a applicant for conditional use permit, in this case a data center developer, applies for a conditional use permit legally, they have the burden to show that they meet the legal standards for the permit. They have what's called the burden of proof, which has to do with presenting evidence that they meet the standards. And they have what's called the burden of persuasion, which is to demonstrate to the decision makers that they meet the standards, to argue and convince them that they meet the standards. Practically, however, there is a presumption that if a use is conditionally allowed in your local zoning code, that use is appropriate for the property in question. And yes, conditional use permit applications do get denied from time to time, but overwhelmingly, most of them end up getting approved, because the idea is if it's listed as conditionally allowed, that's a way of regulating the impacts, of imposing conditions on the use, but it doesn't. But the idea is that, well, it's appropriate in this particular site. In addition, the applicants for a CUP have tremendous advantages in terms of bringing in experts, of developing facts, of the very often sort of substantial financial and economic entities that have resources. They muster sort of all of the skills of advocacy on their behalf, and they can threaten the local government with litigation if their CUP is denied. Throughout the United States, there's tremendous variation on the roles of lawyers. Here in Louisville, lawyers present the applicant's case for a CUP, which means that our hearings here are a little bit more lawyer dominated. When I was the chairman of the Planning Commission of the city of Anaheim, California, if a lawyer got up to speak, that was an instant red flag that there was something wrong. With the proposed use. And so there usually it was the developer or an engineer or an architect or planner or somebody who spoke on behalf of the applicant. But the point I want to make here is that the applicants for data center CUPs have tremendous advantages in convincing the local decision makers that they are entitled to the permit. Again, maybe with limitations, maybe with conditions imposed upon them, but nonetheless, the percentage of CUPs that are going to be granted are going to be greater. So that tells us that if a particular location is really not the right location for a CUP, the underlying zoning should list data centers as prohibited in those locations. That listing them as conditional uses and trying to use the permitting process to filter out or keep out burdensome data centers is not an effective way to regulate. How does the process work? So I'm going to use the Board of Zoning Adjustment here in Louisville as an example. But like I said, I did this, I made these, we participated in making these decisions as a planning commission chairman in Anaheim. And so we start with public notice. There is a public hearing. And so the notice indicates that the applicant has applied for a CUP for a data center, gives some details about it, location, and when and where the hearings are going to be held. Often the public notice is provided to surrounding landowners, posted on the internet, usually posted physically at a site in the city hall or whatever the local county government building or wherever it happens to be. There'll be a public hearing held by the decision-making entity, the Board of Zoning Adjustment, the Planning Commission, whoever's making the decision. And at that hearing, there are basically several things that are going to happen. One is the applicant is going to present their case and all of the support that they have as to why they are entitled to the CUP. The planning staff is usually going to present their assessment and perhaps recommendations about whether or not to grant the CUP and under what conditions. And then there's going to be an opportunity for members of the public to be heard. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a moment, but that's general. And usually with that, that means that then the applicant has an opportunity to rebut any kind of public opposition. The hearing is closed. The decision makers deliberate and make a decision. There has to be, under the law, as a matter of due process, an impartial decision maker, but that does not mean that this decision maker is prohibited from having viewpoints about the appropriateness of data centers, about the community, that sort of thing. It just means that they have to say that they are willing to be open to the evidence that's presented to them. There's a requirement that the applicant and affected neighboring landowners have opportunities to be heard, that the decision is based on evidence in the record, that evidence is sometimes taken under oath. That is true here in Kentucky, that the evidence is given under oath. But in general, it's very rare for local governments to follow court-related or judicially imposed rules of evidence. So the typical rules of evidence that the courts use really don't apply to the local hearings. But there can be an opportunity or even a requirement for cross-examining witnesses under oath and that sort of thing. local government imposes conditions. That's why it's called a conditional use permit, is that the permit is subject to a variety of specifically spelled out listed conditions that the applicant has to comply with. And those conditions are meant to control the impacts that the proposed use has. The decision maker has to make findings of fact on the record, and those findings of fact are what connect the evidence that's been presented to the regulatory standards that are the basis for granting or denying the permit. And then they have to actually enter a decision on the record. Some legal issues that arise. First of all, what kind of evidence, how much evidence? Well, in the land use realm and involving permitting, the applicable legal test is what's called the substantial evidence test, or the sufficiency of the evidence test, which is defined as such relevant evidence as a reasonable person might use in making a reasonable decision. As you can see, the test is very broad, loose, relevant evidence, reasonable person, reasonable decision. The courts have said that can be less than 50% of the evidence. In other words, if, for example, the public presents a substantial amount of, significant amount of evidence, maybe, 52% of the evidence that's presented says that the data center CUP should be not denied. The data center applicant presents 48% that they are entitled to it. The decision maker can choose to grant the permit because the substantial evidence test does not require it be more than half. And what's happening there is the decision maker is weighing both the amount and persuasiveness of the evidence. Hold on, I just skipped that. So another set of issues has to do with managing or controlling adverse impacts that the data center will have. In our standards, we have sort of, when we're talking about adverse impacts, we're talking about permitting. There's sort of a standard three-part trilogy of avoid, minimize, mitigate. So the first preference is that we avoid the impacts altogether. Then if we can't avoid them, we minimize them by reducing them, redesigning the project in some way. And if we can't minimize them, then we mitigate them by offsetting them, by doing something else, planting more trees or improving landscaping or contributing money to the local park fund or school fund or that kind of thing. The reality is that lots and lots of permit applicants and permit decision makers at the governmental level sort of automatically move towards the mitigate. That yes, avoid and minimize is supposed to be the ideal, but very often the applicant will say it's too costly or it's impossible. And so what we have to do is simply just mitigate the impacts. In addition, another problem, another challenge that comes up is that once a conditional use permit is initially granted, it can be often modified or expanded through variances or permit modifications. So what starts out as a smaller data center with minimized or mitigated impacts over time can become a larger center with different operational processes, different greater impacts or bigger impacts of that sort of thing. Another sort of legal issue has to do with both the decision that the local governments make and the conditions they impose in the permit have to have a land use nexus, which means that they have to relate to some sort of land use impact. This is relevant if you're using the conditional use permit to try to regulate the extent to which the local ratepayers are going to pay more for electricity, or the extent to which maybe additional water supplies need to be found or developed, or that sort of thing. Things that aren't land use per se. And so what happens is very often the local government, in order to justify using the conditional use permit process as a way to address those things. Also, by the way, things like fair labor standards and who you hire, people in the community and so forth, they have to find some sort of relationship to the impact on surrounding land uses, or else a court might say, they've exceeded the scope of their zoning power using the conditional use permit to regulate non-land use sorts of things. And then I also just want to briefly mention that there could be state or federal preemption that, kind of, especially if local governments are restricting or regulating data centers more heavily than what the state government prefers or what the federal government prefers, that could be the case. So we have yet to see whether there might be some attempt to, say, for example, declare data centers to be a matter of national security, and therefore, attempt to prohibit local governments from using their zoning powers to regulate data centers. And then I just want to talk briefly about public participation, that there are in this process some ways in which clearly the public has a right, opportunity to participate, but that the public's power is sometimes constrained by the process. So often there are time limits on how much each member of the public can speak, sometimes only, a minute or 3 minutes or something like that. The decision makers want facts, not opinions. They do not consider, when local residents say, hey, a better use of this property that would be for a school rather than a data center, that's not a legitimate consideration. They have to look at the proposed use that they're considering. It can be challenging to coordinate and organize lots of members of the public. And it's one thing to sort of gather or rally support for an ordinance that prohibits or puts a moratorium on data centers. It's another thing to oppose each and every data center one by one on a permit by permit basis. That takes a lot of resources and effort and time and people being available to participate. Supporters of data centers will accuse local opponents as being NIMBYist, which is not in my backyard. And then also there are tremendous barriers and inequities as to who participates in local land use decision makings, when and where the hearings are held, how they're structured, who has the resources, and who has the power. So this is the last slide. Big picture issues are that permitting is important, but we also need to be thinking about industrial zoning reform generally in our communities. We also need to think about the next problematic land uses. So before data centers became a big thing, there were people warning that this was coming along, and we weren't proactive about it, and now we're being reactive about it. Well, what are the next big land uses that are coming along that we also need to be thinking about, that are going to impact communities, or maybe not well defined in our zoning codes, or uncertain or problematic or whatnot? We also need to be thinking about the idea that land use justice movements evolve over time. That's one of the things that I, in particular, and some of my students and I looked at in the Racial Justice in American Land Use book, is how we think about land use justice has moved more and more to broad, multifaceted issues, and more about empowerment and things like health equity and so forth, and community empowerment and so forth. And then finally, I just want to situate this whole sort of discussion about data centers in the reality of this period of time in our history, where we see a lot of assaults on environmental law, environmental justice, land use regulation, and public health, and things that maybe were more widely accepted in previous years are being questioned and challenged. So that gives us a little bit of a context for the the issues of permitting for data centers, and I'd love to answer questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So before we dive into questions, I want to welcome our audience to join me in thanking you, Tony, for what you have shared with us thus far. If you are on Zoom and you're able to utilize the Zoom reactions, feel free to send hand claps and hearts and other types of ways to acknowledge Tony Arnold. Thank you so much. So we've gotten several questions, and I think they are still coming in. So we'll try to get through as many as we can in the time that we have remaining. There are several comments that are in around nuclear. Robert Gold, who I believe is my friend Bob Gold. I'm really glad to see you here. Do you have some insights on other sources of energy, including nuclear, concerns that you may have, pitfalls to consider, especially considering that last bullet on the slide right now, considering the fierce urgency of now and the interesting timing that is right now. Any further to add around that? We've got comments from Bob Gold, David Silverman, and Lynn about nuclear.
Yeah, so I think that whether or not the data centers have a connection to nuclear energy or not is probably not going to be a well, how do I say this? I mean, that certainly might politically affect how a local governmental entity deals with a conditional use permit requirement, but that's probably not going to be a legitimate regulatory standard at the zoning level because, whether the energy comes from this source or that source, probably, unless it's sort of in order to build the data center, we now have to build a nuclear power plant. At that point, you do have a land use impact. And I think what this emphasizes is because there are a variety of different impacts, we silo the permitting process, right? So we have air permits over here, and there's going to be one entity that does that, and then a different entity does the water permits, and the zoning and land uses over here, and then the waste management or is there a brownfield that needs to be remediated and it's over here, and so the whole energy component is often regulated at the state level by a utility commission or something of that nature. They different things, different terms in different states. And they've got a whole different set of regulations that really are not terribly concerned about land use impacts or not terribly concerned about health equity. And so that siloization tends to, again, favor a big entity that's got lots of resources, they've got lots of lawyers, they've got lots of engineers, they've got lots of data, they've got lots of budgeting in order to build this. They're going to plan to get all these permits, and it's much harder for the public to influence the decision-making levers in each of those different sort of permit decision-making. So yeah, I mean, there's obviously how utilities are developed or not, and where we're going to produce this energy are big social questions. And yet I think part of the point of the question is very often we don't have kind of systematic, widespread public discussion of those issues because they get parceled out in these very sort of technical permitting realms.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you. Okay, we've got a couple additional questions coming in. So this is from Paul. A friend tells me the Louisville property was agricultural, but was an EPA Superfund site for ground pollution and has been remediated and given to state EPA. Will a data center meet mitigation standards to include regulations that are currently in effect?
Okay, that's
It's
probably a lot more,
complex.
yeah, a lot more specific than, I mean, that makes a lot of assumptions about facts that I'm not sure if I know precisely myself. So
Yes.
I don't know. I will say what's, I think one thing that's sort of interesting about this is how we have so many brownfields, which might be super fun sites. They might not be super fun, but they're contaminated or believed to possibly be contaminated, and that they therefore need to be remediated. And it also means that we're limiting what we're putting there. We're usually, not always, but usually we should not be putting, on a Superfund site, housing or daycare for young kids or that sort of thing. I mean, sometimes that does happen, but it shouldn't. But the point is that then the presumption is, hey, maybe these make a good site. These kinds of properties make good sites for data centers. And so again, that sort of the idea that we sort of incrementally, cumulatively stack the decision-making process in favor of, yeah, we're gonna find a way to make these things happen is sort of the bottom line. Now, people have, as we know from the viewpoints expressed here, a lot of different viewpoints on here about whether they should or shouldn't. But the point is, the way the process is structured tends to favor the approval of the data centers, unless they're prohibited or there's a moratorium or that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you so much, Tony. We have more questions, but unfortunately, we don't have more time. So I'll direct your attention to the questions in the chat. If you're able to respond to them, we don't want to add any additional pressure onto you because we are so grateful that you have taken your time, you have shared, you have filled us with some really thought-provoking insights on permitting to help us better understand data center development across the US as we're seeing it for some of us in our communities and beyond our communities. So thank you, thank you, thank you for taking time to share. We so appreciate you. I am going to resume screen sharing just to share a couple last minute bits of information with everyone. If you all have continued questions, we welcome you to add those to the chat. That is my friend, Bob Gold. So glad to see you. And thanks for the wave. All right, let me go full screen on my slides as I close things out. We hope that this webinar met your expectations. We would love to hear your feedback on this and also give us some insights on the rest of the series and on the exchange as an initiative. So we would love for you to please take this quick survey. You can scan the QR code on the screen, or you're able to type in this website as you see it listed here on the screen. I'll give you a moment as folks want to log on. And I'm pretty sure I can assume that Joy has also shared this link in the chat. Yep, I see it in the chat. Thank you so much, Joy. So you're welcome to just click. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you so much, Tony Arnold, for coming to share today about data centers and permitting. I am happy to share with you that we do have another webinar coming up on the books on October 19th. That is 2 weeks from now, again at 12 p.m. Eastern. We will be hearing from Steve Del Bianco from NetChoice, who will share about data centers and site selection, that all important question of why are they located where they're located. I think permitting helped to answer one half of this question. I think site selection will be very helpful to answer additional questions that we have about why are they located where they're located. So there are more ways for you to be involved in the discussion around data centers. Please join PSR, APHA, the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments, and the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, and others for a new webinar series on data centers and health. It starts today. It starts just about an hour from now. Our first webinar is today on the health and equity impacts of data centers. And hopefully you see 3 familiar faces, but I trust you see at least one familiar face for today's conversation. So we'd love to see you there. Also, if you're located in Louisville, Kentucky, there are additional opportunities for you to participate in public hearings around data center regulations that are proposed here. August 6th is the next, and it is an online meeting. And August 10th, that takes place at the Kentucky Center for African American Heritage. You're welcome to take a screenshot as you see it here, or utilize that link at the bottom so you can gain more information. And with that, please stay connected by visiting us online at centers.louisville.edu/environ. You can thereby stay up to date on our upcoming events through our events webpage. And we'd love to see you on the socials with us as well. Keep the conversation going there. You can follow us on all the socials at U of L Environ. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you especially to our speaker. We welcome all emojis and likes. I am going to go ahead and stop the recording in case there are any offline questions or discussion for Professor Arnold and if he has time for those.